Saturday, October the 2nd, 1982, the first day of Sukkot.
Please open the Chumashim at page 525. Page 524, verse 39, Leviticus chapter 23. Page 524 in the Chumashim. Ach b'chamisha asa yom la'chodesh hashvi'i, on the 15th day of the 7th month, ospechem mitvuat ha'aretz, when ye have gathered in the fruits of the land, tachogu et chag Adonai shivat yamim, ye shall keep the feast of the Lord 7 days. By yom harishon shabbaton, on the first day shall be a solemn rest. Uvayom hashmini shabbaton, and on the 8th day shall be a solemn rest. Ulakachtem lachem bayom harishon, and ye shall take you on the first day peri etz hadar, the fruit of goodly trees, anaf etz avot, branches of palm tree, kapot tamarim, branches of palm tree, anaf etz avot, boughs of thick trees, v'arvei nachal, and willows of the brook. Usmachtem lifnei Adonai Elohechem shivat yamim, and ye shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. Now, the injunction quite clearly is that the arba minim, or the 4 species, which are mentioned here, first of all, peri etz hadar is mentioned first. You may ask, how do we know that the meaning of peri etz hadar, which is fruit of goodly trees, refers to the citron? That's a very good question. There's no answer, but it's a very good question. It is a tradition that God told Moses on Mount Sinai that the meaning of those 3 words, peri etz hadar, the fruit of a beautiful tree, means the etrog. Does anybody else have another explanation? Rabbi Lewis? You accept? You don't object? Rabbi Rutenberg, any objections? No objections. So, I've got to be very careful. Rabbi Goldman, any objections? I mean, which other rabbi has to go through this business of having to check out with all the rabbis before he goes on? Okay, so peri etz hadar is Misinai. This is one of the, we're talking about legal fictions today. It's the way the Jews solve all problems that they don't know the answers to. Something that happened between God and Moses on Mount Sinai. I have no objection. It's a very beautiful fruit. It smells beautiful. It looks beautiful. I don't know whether we get the same impact from it in Manhattan as our ancestors got from it. Just let's think for a minute. Well, there's no fruit native to Manhattan that I can think of, except perhaps dirt. What? I'm sorry? Oh, just a moment. That is purely metaphorically. I have not seen, I know that trees grow in Brooklyn, but I have not seen an apple tree in Central Park. We have cherry trees there. What I'm saying is that what? You have seen an apple tree in Central Park? You always see the exceptions. I'm sorry, I can't deal with exceptions. What I'm asking is a question which is an important question, namely, the etrog was a common fruit in ancient Palestine. And they were told to take a common fruit, which you could pick from any tree. I don't know how much this one cost. I know when I was a child, to get an etrog, you had to risk your life and limb. Etrogim in pre-modern era, before you had El Al that shipped thousands of etrogim all over the world, they were shipped by boat. They were terribly expensive. There's a large literature in Jewish tradition, especially in Hasidic literature, about how people bankrupted themselves in order to buy the most beautiful etrog they could lay their hands on, and then God rewarded them. The idea was that the more you give to tzedakah or to mitzvah, you get it back again. It's always a good principle. What I'm asking is, what if the etrog was something very common? In other words, for us it has a, it's a derivative. It's a derivative. It has a precious quality. I don't mean precious in a good sense. I mean precious in a, it's removed from its origin. Would anybody try to elaborate the point that I'm trying to make? I'm sure it has some significance in the world of art. The difference between something, let me give you another example. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. You see, all a rabbi has to do is to recite that psalm, and 50 women burst into tears, no matter where you are, whether it's a chasana or a funeral, it makes no difference. The Lord is my shepherd, with your best rabbinical tone, I shall not, when everybody starts getting terribly tearful, it brings back overtones of school and learning things by heart and parents and Christianity and Christmas carols. I don't know what it does. It brings, even in Jews, it brings back all these things. This is ridiculous, because in the culture in which that psalm was first written, a shepherd was as common a sight as a yellow cab is in Manhattan. I don't know why you're being so frivolous this morning. The injunction to rejoice before the Lord does not mean to be frivolous. Or are you all nervous, rather? What I'm saying is that if you take something... Now, my artistic friends in the congregation told me that I was doing something that is being done in architecture today. I was accused on Kol Nidre, or was it Rosh Hashanah? I forget. In the nicest sense of the word, of giving a postmodern sermon, in the sense that architecture uses the term postmodern. Do you know the way in which architecture uses the word postmodern? I use the word postmodern, which indeed I use, I think, on Rosh Hashanah, to mean a perspective on life which takes for granted the intellectual contributions of Einstein, Marx, Freud, the great leaders of what we call modern thought. Now, postmodern is a viewpoint which takes that for granted. In other words, we don't get all excited because somebody says this is a reaction formation or this is projection. Well, this is part of our universe of discourse. We say, what else is new? That's postmodern, in a cultural sense. However, my artistic friend who was in the congregation told me that there's a whole new use of the word postmodern, and that is architecture which deliberately uses styles and idioms which do not belong in the 20th century, borrow them from other eras and put them into the 20th century, and thereby create a whole new idiom, which is an eclectic idiom. The underlying significance is that no single architect or no single architectural style is deemed to contain the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And therefore artists feel, I hope I am reflecting what artists feel, because I am not an artist, I am trying to understand what they're doing. That artists feel that since no particular cultural tradition says the whole truth, including the modern tradition, by being eclectic and bringing in other elements of other great artistic traditions into a modern eclectic ensemble, that one is creating a new style which derives something from the others. However, when you bring, for example, Chippendale into the modern world, not from the original Chippendale context, it is not the same thing as Chippendale, its original context. It's saying something else. And indeed, this person sent me a book, which I am in the process of buying, which gives examples of buildings in which you actually see very modern use of concrete, but also medieval, 18th century, 19th century, all used in a kind of eclectic mélange. Now that interests me, because obviously in a sense we were doing something very similar in the realm of religion, as indeed we are today. We are bringing objects which once had a very specific meaning within a particular culture and using them in a culture where citrus trees simply do not grow. And that has a different derivative effect. As a matter of fact, I believe that even in Israel today, the use of the etrog has a different meaning from the one it has in the diaspora. And I think this has always been the case. I just raised the question. At any rate, that is one thing we ought to look at, and we shouldn't ever say to ourselves, apparently, I have this from my friend now, that it's perfectly okay to say this, that just because a tradition or a ritual comes from a different context and a different era, therefore we can't use it today because those people did this, that, and the other. This is absolutely meaningless. We shouldn't have to learn this from the artists. The artists could have learned it from the theologians. There is always this sense of postmodernism, if you understand Jewish tradition correctly. All this person was saying really was that this is postmodernism, yes.
I think, Rabbi, you're also touching upon a problem which is the second cousin to one that you mentioned at Pesach, namely that in an attempt to observe the mitzvot, certain people are discriminated against because they don't have enough money to go and spend what is being charged now on Essex Street or whatever to get an effort. There was a piece on the news the other night that, somebody was smiling and saying that cost $15, $25, $35, $500 people are spending on their books. And I wonder what the reaction is to the rest of the world when they see one piece of fruit bringing that kind of a price and the kind of dichotomy that it creates in the Jewish community where people who can't afford or want to observe the mitzvah are in effect
I honestly have difficulty buying that. When I was younger, my father, as most of you know, was an Orthodox rabbi, God rest his soul, and I remember from my earliest childhood people arguing we can't keep kosher because it's too expensive. The same people would go and disappear to Spain for 6 weeks during the summer. For that they had money. But for the few pennies that a kosher chicken cost them over and above, now I'm not saying this is not an argument, and I'm certainly not saying that kosher butchers don't have some reckoning to do. I think it was a colleague of mine in England who once said that my butcher is like a kosher fish. He doesn't have fins or scales. And those of us who endured meat rationing during the war and after the war in England know that the kosher butchers rose to a level of communal infamy rarely shared by any group of people in the course of the generations except those people who handed Jews over to the Inquisition. Never mind the rabbi or the judge or the priest, you had to be in the good books of the kosher butcher, otherwise you starved. And did they know it? I mean, plus ça change, every generation, I don't know who's in charge today. One could make a good case for who regards themselves as the top dogs in the community, but when I was a kid, it was a kosher butcher. He presided over he presided over the offal every Friday afternoon, because that wasn't rationed, you see. That could be used for all sorts of delicacies, and the whole community revolved around whether they were in his good graces, but things changed. I think people who spend $5 on going to a movie and $8 or $10 on a meal and manage to go away to East Hampton for weekends shouldn't be too overwhelmed with spending money on an object of ritual. I don't buy this argument. I think we tend to use any kind of an argument against religion. There's overcharging in all areas. Have you had your teeth fixed recently? Don't tell me about overcharging. Never mind. Have you been anywhere recently? Overcharging. I mean, I think relatively speaking, the cost of the etrog compared to what it was in my father's day, I don't think has gone up accordingly. I think there's bulk purchasing. If it's a problem, I don't think one has to buy a $500 etrog. I'm quite sure one can find one below $25. Joel, I don't think this is a major issue. The principle of whether we keep people away from Judaism, if anybody couldn't afford to buy an etrog on Ullah this year, I apologize. If you next year come to me ahead of time and I'll buy you one. We don't turn anybody away from this synagogue because they can't afford to educate their children. We don't turn anybody away because they can't afford to be members. And I am very proud that this is something that the Board of Trustees has always taken for granted. No one was ever deprived of any religious services in this institution because of lack of money. I think what we've been fighting over the years is what we mean by lack of money. There's sometimes a difference of opinion between the congregation and the congregant over what lack of money means. We've had people sending 4 children to private schools who couldn't afford to pay for their Hebrew school education. That's not lack of money. That's a lack of a proper perspective in your fiscal agenda. And in recent months, we have finally decided that in order to get scholarships, you have to show your income tax forms. Exactly the same way it's done at Horace Mann and Fieldston and Riverdale and all those posh schools out there. Why should the synagogues be ripped off? Why should the synagogues be ripped off? We don't mind people coming to us and saying we can't afford, and it's done anonymously. It's done with the greatest tact. I don't want to know who the children who are on scholarship, and neither does the school committee know. I think 2 or 3 people at the most know. I don't want to know who pays and who doesn't pay. Neither does the educator, Judith Tumin, doesn't know either, because we don't want in the slightest way that our attitude should be affected by the knowledge that this one is a scholarship child and this one isn't a scholarship child. But the actual issue, in other words, anonymity is preserved. The least number of people know about it. However, we don't like to be ripped off. And very often people can afford, but they have other priorities. We have a priority. Chinuch, Jewish education. Shabbat, Yom Tov. We like to see a synagogue full of lulavim and etrogim. Now, I don't want to put a guilt trip on anybody so close to Yom Kippur. However, I love seeing a synagogue thronged with etrogim and lulavim. I don't think there's any more festival in the year, even perhaps Pesach, because Pesach is a family festival, where children get a greater sense of what Sukkot means. You see a whole host of people walking around with the lulav and the etrog. I know what impact this had on me when I was a child, and I've tried to share it with you. The Hoshana Rabbah service that we have today comes from me, but it doesn't come from me. It comes from my father. It's a gift from my father to you all. Because I remember what the Hoshana Rabbah service meant to me when I was a child, and I wanted to share it with you. It meant something more than 3 Jews walking around looking bored at 7 o'clock in the synagogue on Hoshana Rabbah morning. And now we have over 100 people. And by the way, if you want to come to our Hoshana Rabbah service, you better book your breakfast because we're almost sold out of seats. Reservations can be made on Monday. The service, Hoshana Rabbah, starts at 7 o'clock. And I want to ask all of you who have lulavim here today, please not to remove them from the synagogue, but to leave them here. If you want to collect them, arrange with Lenny Bloom, our shamash, to collect them tomorrow. But those of you who are not going to use them again, please leave them here, because those who come on Hoshana Rabbah would like to use them for the service on Hoshana Rabbah. Let me just briefly go back to I'm leaving quite a few issues in the air right now. Ulekachtem lachem bayom harishon. Ye shall take you on the first day. The Mishnah specifically says it must be yours. You can't steal it. It's curious. I always wondered as a child how you could have a chapter in the Mishnah which says lulav hagazul. A stolen lulav is not fit to make the bracha over. I mean, how can anybody think? Well, I want to tell you something. We had 4 prayer books on Kol Nidre evening. My wife turns around and within a split second they've all gone. Can you daven with a stolen reconstructionist machzor? Mrs. Klemper had a prayer book which she brings every year, which contains a letter which is the last letter her husband wrote to her. Somebody stole that too. You'd think somebody would think twice on Kol Nidre, talesim disappear. Lulav hagazul, the Jews haven't changed over the years. We have honest Jews and we have ganovim. Ganovim at the SAJ. Can you imagine? Of course, those must be people who didn't buy seats. If you don't, we hope. If you didn't buy a seat, you're not going to bother about stealing a prayer book. I hold onto my prayer book for dear life on Yom Tov. If anybody comes anywhere near me, I say, go away. I've got all my markings on. When I have to scream, when I have to look sad, when I have to throw the babies out, it's all there. It's all there. Somebody should steal this from me, they take my life away. I would be like the sorcerer's apprentice without the broom. I mean, you have to be very careful with these things. Lulav hagazul, you can't steal them. So that's why you have to give when somebody wants to make a bracha over the lulav, you have to give it to them. It's called in Jewish tradition, I love Jewish tradition, it's so paradoxical, it's so much like us. Matana almanat lahachzir, it's like human beings, full of contradictions. You give a gift on condition that you'll get it back again. Matana almanat lahachzir. This is a contradiction in terms, isn't it? Can you think of a bigger paradox? Matana almanat lahachzir. I give you this lulav because God says you can only make a bracha over, you can only fulfill the mitzvah lulav if it's your own. But after you fulfill the mitzvah with your own lulav, mark you give it back to me because it cost me $500 according to Joe, whatever. So that's why you have to say, I give it to you. There are other mitzvot which you can perform without asking people's permission. If you come to shul and you've left your tefillin at home, God forbid this should happen to you, and you don't have your tefillin with you, your phylacteries, you can borrow somebody else's tefillin. If you leave your talit behind, you can borrow somebody else's talit. You know why? Because Jewish tradition assumes that Jews would not object to other people performing mitzvot with their property. But when it comes to the lulav and the etrog, the arba minim, this must be your own, and it's based on ulekachtem lachem. The Bible specifically says you shall take for you. Now, having said that, I don't believe a word of it. I don't believe that the reason why your lulav had to be your own is based on ulkachtem lachem. I believe that in the beginning you had to have your own lulav, and ulkachtem lachem was given as the rationale. Rabbi Goldman, you're always very good at this sort of thing. Monday morning quarterbacking. Well, think about it and see if it can... What? It doesn't sound good. It sounds as if there's another reason why your lulav has to be your own. It's a little bit like... Something reminds me of the Seder night. The Mishnah says... Every Jew must drink 4 glasses of wine. Even Jews on welfare who get food from the soup kitchen must drink 4 glasses of wine. Something funny going on there. We won't talk about that. I think that has something to do with Dionysius. We'll talk about it on another occasion. How the Jews always give the game away. Whenever you have a festival where there's clear evidence of a pagan influence and the Jews begin arguing over certain details, there's always a touch of some kind of pagan ritual. I think with Pesach, it's Dionysus we are worrying about. With Sukkot, there are these great agricultural gods who die and are reborn, of which Dionysus is also one, but he seems to come out more potently in the spring. But this is another subject. Now, in the days of the temple, obviously, the question arose of what you did if the first day of Sukkot fell on Shabbat. There's a cluster of problems. If the first day of Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat, certain days cannot fall on certain days. The Jewish calendar is so constructed that Rosh Hashanah can never fall on Monday, Wednesday, or Friday. Because otherwise Yom Kippur would fall on a Friday or on a Sunday, and that would be an impossibility. So what you have is, you can have Yom Kippur on Saturday, but there are certain days in the week when Yom Kippur cannot fall, and that is how the calendar is organized. However, other days do coincide, and usually Shabbat takes priority. Shabbat takes precedence over every festival, except Yom Kippur. The question was whether the shofar could be blown. The shofar was blown in the temple on Shabbat. We don't blow the shofar here because we have 2 days Rosh Hashanah. If we only had 1 day Rosh Hashanah, and as the years go on, I'm beginning to think it might not be a bad idea. I always think the second day is somewhat anticlimactic. But we're well away from that discussion right now. We have other fish to fry for the time being. So we don't blow the shofar on the first day, we blow the shofar on the second day, and it creates a nice kind of contrast. But what do you do in a synagogue like ours when you only observe 1 day of Yom Tov, Palestine, Israel fashion? You have 1 day at the beginning of Sukkot and you have 1 day at the end. Now, in an Orthodox synagogue, in a traditional synagogue, the lulav will be used tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day for the entire festival. But at the SAJ, where people don't turn out in droves for these festivals, if this day wasn't a Shabbat, I shudder to think what kind of a congregation. This is not a criticism. Different synagogues have different strengths. Lincoln Square has great attendance records. I think it's very wonderful. I think it's very important for Jews to turn out en masse all the time if possible. I'd love to have a full synagogue. It's good for my narcissism, it's good for Jewish tradition, it's good for God, it's good for all sorts of things. However, we shouldn't approach this problem of numbers with a sense of guilt. Those groups of believers where myth is strong, or myth is believed to be strong, or there is a pretense that myth is strong, I'm giving all possible options, tend to put their bodies before their hearts and their minds very often. We have other strengths which are equally, if not more important, in spite of the fact we do not have numbers, and therefore I don't want to put a guilt trip on anybody, but the issue arose when we switched from the 2-day Yom Tov to the first day Yom Tov. The issue arose what we would do with the lulav. And I had to make a decision, and we decided to have the lulav on the first day of the festival. Those of us who come from Orthodox backgrounds feel a little uncomfortable because we remember how strongly people felt about it. And out of respect to our Orthodox neighbors who would be somewhat perplexed if they saw a load of lulavim like Burnham Wood on the way to Dunsinane come walking through West 86th Street, I urge you not to remove the lulavim from the synagogue today, out of respect for Jews who have a different view to ours. But here within the synagogue, we carry our lulavim proudly. The Mishnah deals with the issue on many occasions. Yom Tov, this is the 13th Mishnah of the 3rd chapter of Sukkah. This is a special tractate. Yom Tov Harishon Shel Chag Shechal Liot B'Shabbat. What happens when the first day of Sukkot is Shabbat? Kol ha'am molichin et lulavehen levet hakneset. Everybody takes their lulav to the synagogue Friday afternoon. Everybody carries the lulav to the synagogue. Not just to the temple, to the synagogue. Lamocharat mashkimin uva'in. The next day they all get up early and come to the synagogue on time. Kol echad ve'echad makir et shelo. Everybody recognizes his own lulav. This is incredible. It's unbelievable. That's mine. No, it's not. That's mine. Everybody recognizes his own lulav and takes it. Mipnei she'amru chachamim, because the sages have said, Ein adam yotzei chovato b'yom tov harishon shel chag, on the first day of the festival, apparently other than all the other days, but on the first day of Yom Tov, the first day of Sukkot, a man does not fulfill his obligation unless he performs the mitzvah with his own lulav, not his friend's. It has to be his own. So either he has bought his own, or his friend has to give him a gift in order to return it. By the way, this concept of matana al manat lahachzir is a little bit like selling chametz. You sell chametz to somebody, but you're going to get it back again. I always used to fantasy as a child. My father was an Orthodox rabbi, and every day before Pesach, Ta'anit Bechorot, all the congregations sold their chametz to him, and I never understood it very clearly. Legal fictions were not my strong point as a child. And I said to my father, but the caretaker used to have all the chametz. I said to my father, but supposing he absconds. My father could never appreciate that point. He looked at me with absolute disdain. How could he have produced a child who would ask such ludicrous questions? Maybe I suspected Gentiles, now I suspect Jews. In other words, you give the guy all this whiskey and all the chametz, and you give him the keys, and you say it's yours for 8 days. I'd go to Florida during the 8 days. It's yours legally. I mean, it would stand up in court. Who would read Aramaic these days? Yes? That's very interesting. That's a very interesting point. That point is that on some level in Jewish, I think you're onto something very interesting here. In Jewish tradition, again, you know, this is all sort of messianic. I don't believe Jews ever actually lived like this. But you can't always be careful. You can't always be too careful. That the idea was that property should not remain in perpetuity. That you had a 50-year cycle in which to sell property. But at the end, in Jubilee year, all property reverts to the original owners. There's a democratic principle involved here, isn't there? A democratic principle involved here. So what you're saying is that when you buy and sell houses and fields, there's an underlying notion that sooner or later it's going to come back again. That's what you're saying. There is an element there. It's an interesting point. I wonder whether this has some kind of democratic principle behind it. Yes? Yeah, I think there is a very intense democratic principle operating throughout Jewish tradition, whereby even though we go through the game of playing at capitalists, at the end of 50 years, we wipe out the slate. It's like playing Monopoly. You start from scratch again, which I don't know whether it was ever actually performed. But one has to be careful. I got the shock of my life in the Jewish Museum in Jerusalem, reading a document which indicated that a law which I had thought was never, ever fulfilled was actually a common practice. In the book of Deuteronomy it says that if a man is so poor that he has to pawn the cloak in which he sleeps with at night time, you can keep it as a pawn, but at night time you have to hand it back to him, because how's he going to sleep? I thought this was ridiculous. Can you see Mr. Rudin going around to all his apartments, giving them their sheets to sleep in at night time? I mean, I can't see that at all, can you? And there was this document which says quite clearly that somebody had taken somebody to the local judge because he'd forgotten to return his blanket at night time. indicating quite clearly that this Deuteronomic law was in fact, at least on this occasion, actually appealed against. We don't know what the result was. In view of what the prophets say about the way in which the wealthy Jews behaved to the poor Jews, it's hard to believe that it was possible that they really did this all the time. But the fact that one single document exists which indicates that somebody invoked this, I want my bed back, he said. I can't sleep without this cloak, gives us pause. Another Mishnah says that when Saturday and the first day of Yom Tov coincide, as far as the temple was concerned, all the Jews would carry their lulavim to the temple. See, the synagogues referred to outside of the temple, but as far as the temple was concerned, they all brought them to the temple the day before, and the chazanim, the word chazan in those days apparently referred to the administrator, would look after them, place them in a certain place, and the elders would put them in, just like the SAJ. The hoi polloi have to hang their coats up on the racks, but the yachsonim, Henry takes the coats and hangs them up in that little room. So apparently this is an old sacred Jewish tradition. 2,000 years ago, the elders would leave them in the lishka, but the hoi polloi, the masses, amcha, used to leave them just outside. And each one had to make a statement. And the statement was, if by chance tomorrow I don't get the right lulav, you get mine, I get yours, I give it to you as a gift, because they're worrying about the same problem. You know, I don't believe that this has a ritual significance. I don't believe this has a ritual significance. I think that Jennifer is right. I think there is a very deep spiritual principle involved here. And the actual ritual is unimportant, because people, intelligent people, don't go crazy about giving something. It's like children playing backwards and forwards, unless the notion that sometimes, it's very interesting, even though Jewish tradition believes that at the end of 50 years you tear up all the leases and all the mortgages, nevertheless, on some level, private property also is sacred. I wonder whether there's something of that. Jennifer, would you buy this idea? In other words, that there's occasionally, when even ritually, we have to, in other words, although after 50 years you tear up all the mortgages, that doesn't mean that during the 50-year period you don't play the game earnestly and seriously. That private property is important, that human beings need to possess things. You need to stand in your own soil. Why? My wife only this morning, if I may quote her, said to me, I was going to say at breakfast, we didn't have breakfast, so I'm not quite sure when the conversation could have taken place. She liked this prayer. I remember this prayer, the prayer that I read in English, the one that we sing in the middle of the Avodah service. I didn't mention this year because we were doing so many other things. It's an alphabetical prayer, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, which is why some of the things sound rather peculiar. We should have a year of prosperity, a year of good decrees, a year of dew, a year of rain, a year with little income tax, a year where we don't have to borrow from the bank, a year when we don't have to, foreclose on people's mortgages, a year when there'll be lots of children, when you will bless the fruit of our land and the fruit of our womb. And my wife said to me, it's interesting, she said, it's interesting that things that you enjoy are okay in Judaism. It's true. Physical things, property, children, food, parnasa, a good living. There's nothing to be ashamed of, as long as you don't rip off the other guy in the process. As long as your money, it doesn't come about because somebody else is having his throat slit. As long as you're not underpaying your employees in order to become rich. That's something else again. In other words, it's all right to enjoy a good meal. It's all right to enjoy good clothes. It's all right to enjoy a comfortable house, but not at the expense of the poor. And by the same token, although in the Jubilee everything goes back to the original owners, 50 years is a long time. I remember as a child, I used to be fascinated in England where they used to publish the leases on the outside of the house. They printed, when the house was for sale, they used to actually print it. You said the lease is 999 years. And I asked my father so many, I only remember asking my father questions. I never remember getting any answers. Occasionally my ear would be pulled. Those were the good questions. The good questions always led to some physical violence because he wasn't into answering these questions. So why 999 years? Nobody lives 999 years. In other words, you have a certain span of time to play the game. You know, you can play Monopoly if you have a couple of hours. If somebody says, we're going to play a game of Monopoly, we only have 15 minutes, that's no fun. What can you do with Park Avenue in 15 minutes? Even if you get Park Avenue, or the chance you might get Park Avenue back from somebody else. So, Jennifer, we are grateful to you for drawing our attention to that notion of democracy. I think we have an answer to this. I think the notion that every Jew must make the bracha with his own. Judaism isn't a selfish religion. It's a kind of a sacrosanctity of private property. Judaism says, yes, we are Democrats and we believe in the giving away of mortgages after 50 years, but during that period, we stress private property. But what happened in the temple? What happened was that Jews behaved like Jews, for the most part. The Chazanim got afraid, and instead of giving them one by one, they threw them at the people, and there was a whole, what do they call this? Everybody again, it was like a football game. You know what football is? Spelled F-O-O-T-B-A-L-L. It's what Americans don't have right now. I hope there won't be pogroms in the in Middle America if the football doesn't come back very soon. They fought. It was like a football match. They began to hit each other with ulavim. On guard. That's mine. Give it back to me. And people got hurt. So finally, when the Beit Din saw that people were getting into danger, they decided that the lulav should not be brought to the temple and it should be done in their own home. Now, I don't think any of these homiletical answers really go to the heart of the problem, why the first day became a problem, whether we should or should not use the lulav. And I think that here we have something that's bound up with a very emotional feeling on the part of our ancestors that somehow the temple was special. There was something very unique about the temple and something to do with the prerogatives of the temple, and sort of overflowing from those prerogatives the notion that somehow we're still in mourning for the temple and we do certain things this way because our cup does not overflow, that somehow when the Messiah comes we'll have the lulav on all days, including Shabbat. We will blow the shofar even on Rosh Hashanah. It is not a problem which is easily resolved, but the tradition clearly says that on the first day, which is today, you take these fruits. And so in a sense, we have bypassed 2,000 years of rabbinic tradition dealing with the diaspora and have returned to the original tradition again. So the fruit of a comely tree then is determined as the citron, kapot tamarim, palm branches, which is the lulav. This is kapot tamarim. This is not so unique to Eretz Israel. You have these in Florida too. Anaf etz avot, the leaves of a thick tree, which is traditionally known as the hadas, the myrtle, and arvei nachal, the willows of the brook. Joel, you had another question? Well, first of all, the verb would not be used like that in the Bible. I think ulakachtem lachem, the rabbis took it to mean lachem. You know, lachem is, but you know the way the rabbis stress even personal words. For example, in the Haggadah, you have lachem velo lo. Remember with the wicked son.
Well, what I was thinking was, if you interpret the lakachtem one way, you could say that when you're in synagogue and you don't have lulav and metro, you can walk over to someone else and take it, not steal it, take it in the borrowing sense.
No, but you can't. You can't. The tradition is that it has to be given. Which is no, Joe, you're trying to take this seriously. I am trying to suggest, what I'm trying to suggest is that at this time of the year, and we have to stop very shortly, this time of the year we are in the presence of a mass of the most beautiful traditions which date from way before the Jewish people was a twinkle in the eye of the creator of the universe. In other words, a lot of this stuff has been tamed, it has been civilized, it's been disciplined. You remember this year, for the first time, I began to understand why the rabbis in the Talmud spend so much time discussing the notes of the shofar. You know, the shofar, it's the same kind of thing. It says utekatem. Well, we all know what a tekiah is, a long note. And it says yom teruah. But what is teruah? We know what a tekiah is. What is a teruah? So somebody says teruah is in the Aramaic yevava. Then the question is, what is yevava? Yevava can either mean 3 notes or it can mean 9 notes. So you don't know. So there you have a whole mathematical computation. You have tekiah, shivarim, teruah, tekiah. 3 times because you never know whether you did it right the first time. You always have to, more than once. Then you have tekiah, shivarim, tekiah. Then you have tekiah, teruah, tekiah. Suddenly you look at the discussion and you realize the discussion is not post hoc. The discussion is the result of something that's happened earlier. There is a tradition of making noise, a lot of noise. But the rabbis always try to diminish the amount of noise. They don't succeed, but it's an old tradition. Less noise, less orgy, less unbridled. I even feel that the description today that there was a fight in the temple over the Lulavim in itself is a severely attenuated vestigial trace of the kind of madhouse that you read about in the 7th chapter of Durkheim's The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, when the natives celebrating these equinoxes and solstices would literally fight each other, kill each other in their orgies and cut themselves and mutilate themselves. We inherit these little snippets of behavior. We have the vaguest idea where they come from, and when we find out, we don't want to know anyway. We really don't want to know about how primitive we all are. Rabbi Kaplan, God bless him, tried to get rid of the Haftarot for Sukkot, but I had to disagree with him with great respect, and we brought them back again. We won't have time to discuss this morning's Haftarah, but I'd love to have read it out to you and asked you what it sounded like to you. This description, I'm really stopping in 2 minutes now. We're on page 972. Well, on your own time, just read this Haftarah again and tell me what it brings to your mind. Did anybody in this congregation react to the Haftarah this morning? I'm really asking you, what did it sound like? What did it sound like, this? It sounded like Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And there shall come to be, it says, one day which shall be known as the Lord's, not day and not night, and it shall come to pass that at evening time there shall be light. It sounded like Armageddon. It sounded like some terrible apocalyptic holocaust. Now, where do the Jews come up thinking about this at this time of the year? Where do Jews at the festival which is said, Zaman Simchatenu Noch, the season of our rejoicing, the first day of the festival, tradition prescribes a Haftarah which is scary, which speaks of violent destruction. And we're talking about why we don't use the lulav on the first day, because once upon a time there was a fight in the temple where people hit each other with their lulavim. I am telling you, my friends, that little description of the fight that took place in the temple is a severely attenuated vestigial trace of a memory of what was really behind the decision to have this Haftarah on the first day of Sukkot. That in the Mishnah they just refer to a couple of guys poking each other's eyes out. But in the Haftarah, the bomb falls. There are so many traditions. Join us over the celebrations in the days to come. The Hoshana Rabbah service takes place at 7 o'clock on Friday morning. Every single one of you is invited. If you haven't been to Hoshana Rabbah service before, you are depriving yourself of a real experience. We are not fundamentalists here. We are not fabrentas here. What we do, we think about doing. You will enjoy the ritual and the beauty, especially with the children, as we beat the Arabot against the floor of the synagogue. Come and join us on Hoshana Rabbah. Next Friday night at 6, we celebrate Shmini Atzeret. Next Shabbat is Yizkor. And next Saturday night at 7 o'clock, we will dance around the synagogue, the Zaman Simchat Torah, the rejoicing of the law. We're often accused here of being intellectual Jews, and we take it as a compliment. We don't think that we should just perform these rituals blindly. We like to try to study and find vestigial traces. I find these vestigial traces extraordinarily meaningful because it makes me feel that we are not just Jews, a nation set apart from others, but that we are part and parcel of the very fiber of humanity. We have spiritualized many of these traditions. We have given them ethical significance. We have given them a meaning which transcends their pagan origins. Let us not indulge in here, above all places, in what is known as the genetic fallacy. Lilies which grow from dunghills are lilies. They're better lilies than the lilies that don't grow from dunghills. Join us for our festivities, and let us hope as the days proceed, we will learn more about the meaning of these traditions. You shall take for you on the first day the fruit of goodly trees, branches of palm trees, boughs of thick trees, willows of the brook, and rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. Ye shall keep it a feast unto the Lord 7 days in the year. It is a statute forever in your generations. Ye shall keep it in the 7th month. Ye shall dwell in booths. All that are homeborn in Israel shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Please rise for Aleinu.